The Speedo would climb past anything the blue Ford Telstar was designed to handle. Sean Knowles gripped the wheel with white knuckles, his foot flat to the floor. The engine screaming in protest. Beside him in the passenger seat, Patrick twisted to look through the rear window again. In the back seat, Faye Knowles held on to her younger son Wayne with one arm, the other braced against the door as the car began to shake. The two family dogs barked frantically, picking up on the terror that had seized their owners. "It's still there," Patrick said, his voice tight. It was 4 a.m. on January the 20th, 1988. They were on one of the most isolated stretches of road on Earth, the air highway crossing the Nullarbor Plain. No houses, no lights, no help for over 100 kilometres in any direction. Just endless black desert and a ribbon of worn bitumen disappearing into the darkness ahead. And behind them, something was following. Sean had pushed the Telstar to speeds it had never reached before. The car rattled and shook, threatening to come apart at the seams. But no matter how fast he drove, 180, 190, approaching 200 kilometres an hour, the thing just kept pace. "Faster," Faye heard herself say, "Go faster." There was nowhere left to go. The accelerator was already pressed to the floor. The engine couldn't give them any more. And still, through the rear window, they could see it. That impossible light, bright white with a yellow core, gliding effortlessly through the night air. Matching their speed, gaining on them. Wayne's hands were shaking. Patrick's breathing had gone shallow and quick. The dogs wouldn't stop barking, whining. A horrible noise. Sean's eyes darted between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, watching that light grow closer. And then the car began to feel different. Heavier somehow, as if something had changed in the air, in the atmosphere around them. And that's when they heard the sound. Welcome to Struth, a podcast where we venture into Australia's most perplexing mysteries that continue to defy explanation decades later. I'm your storyteller, Mark, and today we're travelling to the Nullarbor Plain in January 1988, just 6 days before Australia's Bicentennial celebrations, where the Knowles family encountered something that would make international headlines, divide scientific opinion, and change their lives forever. This is the story of a single mother and her 3 sons who set out on an ordinary road trip and instead experienced 90 minutes of pure terror that left physical evidence, credible witnesses, and questions that remain unanswered nearly 40 years later. Police who investigated found them in a state of genuine shock. A truck driver who encountered them immediately afterward examined their car and couldn't explain what he saw. Scientific analysis would later suggest mundane explanations, but the witnesses never wavered from their account. Whatever happened on that isolated stretch of highway between Majura and Mundrabilla, it was real enough to leave 4 people permanently changed, their car damaged, and the Nullabor's reputation for strangeness reinforced. The name Nullarbor Plain comes from the Latin nullus arbor, no trees, and the landscape lives up to that promise across 200,000 square kilometres of ancient limestone seabed, stretching from Western Australia into South Australia. The Air Highway, EYRE, cuts across this expanse like a scar. In 1988, when our story takes place, the road had only been fully sealed for 12 years, and heavy truck traffic had already worn the surface down to barely 5.5 metres wide, just enough for 2 vehicles to pass safely. The famous 90-mile straight runs for almost 150 kilometres without a single curve, the longest straight stretch of road in Australia. Between Majura and Mundrabilla, the stretch where this terror would unfold, roadhouses sit up to 180 kilometres apart. At 4 a.m, help is impossibly distant. There were no mobile phones, of course, in 1988, no roadside assist, and most roadhouses that were there were closed for the night. This place is so desolate that the Royal Flying Doctor Service often use sections of the highway as emergency airstrips. The night sky above the Nullarbor is spectacular and disorienting. With virtually zero light pollution, stars appear in such density that they even cast faint shadows. But those same clear atmospheric conditions that create this celestial display also produce something else: superior mirages. When warm air sits above cooler air, light refracts dramatically. Distant vehicle headlights can appear elevated, distorted, floating. This is a phenomenon that we've discussed in an earlier episode regarding the elusive Min lights. Explorer Edward John Eyre, the first European to cross it in 1841, described it as a hideous anomaly, a blot on the face of nature, the sort of place one goes to in their nightmares. His companion was murdered during the crossing. His horses died of dehydration. The Nullarbor has been testing travellers ever since. And it was into this desolation that Faye Knowles drove her 3 adult sons in a blue Ford Telstar. Everything they owned packed into one car. Faye was 48, a single mother, seeking a fresh start. She decided to relocate from Perth to Adelaide to stay with relatives, and she'd loaded Patrick, 24, Sean, 21, and Wayne, 18, into the recently purchased 84 Telstar for the 2,700 kilometre journey. They planned to drive straight through, taking shifts at the wheel, crossing the desert at night when temperatures were more bearable. By the time they reached the Nullabor's most remote stretch, they'd been driving for approximately 13 hours with minimal stops. The radio had long given up to static. The only sounds were the engine's hum, the rush of the wind, and the rhythmic thump of tyres on pavement. It was just after 4 a.m, January 20, 1988. Sean was at the wheel. Patrick sat in the front passenger seat. Faye, Wayne, and 2 family dogs were in the back. They were approximately 40 kilometres west of Mundrabilla, in an area called the Basin. And that's when Sean saw something on the road ahead. A light. At first, Sean dismissed it as oncoming traffic. The Nullarbor saw enough truck traffic that you learned to recognise the pattern of approaching headlights. But as they drew closer, something started to feel wrong. The light wasn't moving like it should. It seemed to hover, dancing slightly above the road surface. "Do you think that could be a spaceship?" Sean asked Patrick, half joking. Patrick scoffed, "Of course not." But curiosity began to get the better of them both. Sean pressed the accelerator, pulling closer to investigate. Within 20 metres, they could finally see it clearly. What Faye would later describe as an egg in an egg cup, approximately 1 metre wide, glowing bright white with a yellow centre. It sat on or just above the road, moving slightly back and forth as if suspended by invisible strings. And then it moved. Sean swerved violently as the object crossed directly into their path. Headlights appeared suddenly from the opposite direction. A station wagon towing a caravan also swerving to avoid the light. The 2 vehicles missed each other by metres, both drivers fighting for control on the narrow highway. The Knowleses watched as the light seemed to circle back, now pursuing the station wagon that had narrowly avoided them. The other vehicle's taillights disappeared into the darkness at high speed. "We should check on them," Faye said from the back seat, her voice tight with concern. Sean executed a U-turn, accelerating to catch up, but within moments, fear overwhelmed good intentions. The light was coming back, and now it was coming for them. Sean made another U-turn, this time fleeing. He floored the accelerator, pushing the Telstar faster than it was meant to go on these or any roads. The speedo climbed past 180 kilometres an hour, past 190, almost 200. The faster we went to get away from it, Patrick would later tell police, the faster this object went after us. Behind them, through the rear window, they could see it, that bright white light with its yellow core, matching their speed effortlessly, gaining on them despite Sean pushing the car to its absolute limits. The dogs began to panic, barking and whining in a way Faye had never heard before. Wayne was fully awake now, twisted in his seat to watch the light pursuing them. The interior of the car filled with the smell of fear and overheated engine. And then they heard it, a heavy metallic clunk that reverberated through the car's frame. "Something's on the roof," Patrick said, his voice barely above a whisper. The car suddenly felt different, heavier, as though an enormous weight had settled onto them, pressing down from above. Sean struggled in vain with the steering wheel. The Telstar was fighting him, pulling to one side as if invisible hands were grabbing at it. "Something seemed to be on top of us," Patrick said. "We looked around, but it didn't seem to be there. It seemed to grab the car." That's when Faye Knowles made the decision that would become the most famous and most controversial detail of the entire incident. Inexplicably, she reached out, rolled down a window, and stretched her hand toward the roof to feel whatever had landed there. What she touched defied description. Years later, she would struggle to find words. Soft and rubbery was the best she could manage. Warm but not burning, spongy, like nothing she'd ever felt before. And when she pulled her hand back inside, it was covered in black, powdery residue. Almost immediately, the interior of the car began to change. A grey-black mist started seeping in, filling the cabin with smoke that carried an overwhelming stench. Patrick rolled down his window and was instantly covered in fine dust. The smell, they would later describe it as like dead bodies, gas, a blown fuse, something acrid and wrong. And then their voices changed. Patrick noticed it first. When he tried to speak, the words came out different. Slower, deeper, distorted. Slower, deeper, distorted. "Our voices started changing," he would tell investigators. "You know how a tape deck sounds when the batteries start to go flat? That's what it was like." All four of them experienced it. Their speech became elongated, pitched lower, as though time itself had slowed inside the car. The dog's barking took on the same quality, drawn out, warped. More physical sensations followed in a rush. Their hair started standing straight up as if electrified. An intense heat building inside the car. The feeling, Faye and Patrick both reported this independently, that something was going into their heads. Patrick felt like his brain was being sucked out. The sensation of dehydration, of being completely drained. And through it all, that weight pressing down on the roof, the car struggling to maintain speed despite Sean's foot flat against the accelerator. You could actually feel the car rising in the air, Patrick said. That Ford Telstar lifted off the road. They were certain of it. The sensation of weightlessness, of tyres no longer in contact with bitumen, of being carried by something that had grabbed them and was now pulling them skyward. And then, just as suddenly, they dropped. The car slammed back onto the highway with brutal force. The rear right tyre exploded on impact, rubber shredding against the road. Sean fought for control as the Telstar shuddered and fishtailed. Everything went white for a moment, he would later say. He briefly blacked out. But somehow he managed to bring the vehicle to a stop on the shoulder. For a few seconds, nobody moved. They sat in stunned silence, the car filled with that foul-smelling mist, their voices still distorted, hearts hammering. "Get out," Faye finally managed. "Get out of the car." They scrambled into the darkness, fleeing into the roadside scrub. Faye, Patrick, Sean and Wayne, followed by two terrified dogs. They crouched in the low bushes about 15 metres from the highway, watching their car. The light still hovered above it. For 15 long minutes they waited, hidden in the Nullarbor darkness, watching that inexplicable glow suspended over the blue Telstar. Then, finally, it darted away, moving impossibly fast across the sky before vanishing completely into the pre-dawn darkness. They changed the tyre in near silence, hands shaking so badly they could barely work the lug wrench. None of them wanted to talk about what had just happened. Speaking it out loud would make it real, and making it real meant accepting that everything they understood about the world had just been violated. The closest sign of civilization was the Mundrabilla Roadhouse, still kilometres ahead. Sean, reluctantly, got back behind the wheel. Nobody argued about who should drive, and they made their way slowly up the highway, the spare tyre thumping rhythmically, the smell of that black residue still clinging to everything. It was approximately 4:45 a.m. when they pulled into the roadhouse parking area. A man stood near his truck, preparing for an early start. Graham Henley looked up as the Telstar approached and immediately recognised something was wrong. They were in a state of shock, he would later tell reporters. Real shock, not performance. He'd seen enough road accidents in his years of long-haul trucking to know the difference. The family tumbled out of the car trying to explain, the words coming in a rush. Henley listened without judgment and then asked to examine their vehicle. What he found gave him pause. 4 distinct dents on the roof, positioned as though something had grabbed the car from above, as though the car had been picked up by a magnet, was how he described it. Black ash covered both the exterior and interior. He could see it coating the dashboard, the seats, even the ceiling fabric. The ash felt like fine silicon and carried a burnt odour he recognised, Bakelite, or like something when you blow a fuse. The rear tyre was shredded and he noticed the dogs were still cowering in the vehicle, refusing to come out. Then he told them something that made Faye grab her son's arms. He'd seen it too. About an hour earlier, Henley had been driving east when he'd noticed something in his rearview mirror. A light that was too high up to be another truck or vehicle. White and yellow in colour, disappearing and reappearing over several minutes. He'd watched it for about 5 minutes, and during that entire time, he never saw any car lights beneath it. Just this floating light, moving against the dark sky. Like a big fried egg hung upside down, was how he described it. Henley gave them coffee, let them compose themselves, and suggested they drive to Ceduna, about 500 kilometres east, to report what had happened to police. He and 2 friends drove back to the incident site later that day to look for evidence. They found skid marks on the highway, footprints in the dirt where the family had run into the scrub. Tyre tread tracks consistent with a car pulling off the road and stopping suddenly. Everything the Knowles family had described was there in the physical evidence. But the most compelling thing Graham Henley found was the expression on Faye Knowles' face. It took them another 5 hours to reach Ceduna, 500 kilometres of driving with a spare tyre, the smell of that black residue still permeating the car, jumping at every distant light on the highway. By the time they walked into the police station around 9:30 a.m, they'd had hours to second-guess themselves, to wonder if they should even report it. Sergeant Fred Longley took their statement. So did Sergeant Jim Fennell and Constable Bob Hagan. And what impressed the officers wasn't just the story, it was the condition of the witnesses. They were in a terrible state, Longley noted in his report. Even though it was 5 hours after the incident, it was clear that something had happened out there. He examined the car himself, running his hands over the roof dents, the ash still coating every surface despite 500 kilometres of driving. Their car, even after being driven all that way, still had black ash or dust all over it, even on the inside. Where did that come from? There's no soil like that out there, only sand. The police took the report seriously enough to refer the case to UFO Research South Australia. They officially dismissed any suggestion that this was a hoax. Constable Hagan put it plainly. Reports of UFO sightings usually don't hold much water with us, but after checking their car and seeing them, we think there could be something in this. Within 36 hours, the story broke nationally. UFO attacks family led morning news broadcasts across Australia. The Knowles family impressed television audiences with their sincerity. Faye's simple statement, "I won't turn the lights off at night. I'm too scared to go to sleep," captured the genuine trauma they'd experienced. These weren't people seeking attention or trying to profit from a tall tale. These were 4 ordinary Australians who had encountered something extraordinary and were still trying to process it. But then came something that complicated the narrative even further. A tuna fishing crew operating about 80 kilometres offshore in the Great Australian Bight reported that they too had been buzzed by an unidentified flying object at roughly the same time on the same morning. Most remarkably, the fishermen reported experiencing the same voice distortion the Knowles family described. Their words became slow and warped. They saw an elongated vertical light in the sky. And here's the critical detail. The fishing crew couldn't have known about the Knowles family's experience when they made their report. The sightings occurred hundreds of kilometres apart. There was no way they could have coordinated their stories. Channel 7 television paid the Knowles family $5,000 for exclusive access and commissioned a laboratory analysis of their vehicle. What came back was disappointing to those hoping for extraordinary findings. No significant dust was observed on the vehicle as presented for inspection. But there was a reason for this. By the time scientists examined the car, it had been driven 500 kilometres from the incident site, parked at a police station, and, according to investigators, curious townspeople had swarmed all over it, touching everything, examining the roof, effectively contaminating any potential forensic evidence. The Australian Mineral Development Laboratory conducted its own analysis and found only particles of clay and salt, materials entirely consistent with a vehicle that had recently crossed the Nullarbor Plain near enough to the Great Southern Ocean. In effect, their conclusion was the car was just dusty. The black deposit on the tyre rims? Brake lining material, consistent with high-speed driving. The roof dents? Described as very minor, of a sort likely to be caused by the use of a roof rack. More importantly, there was no documentation proving these dents didn't exist before the incident. The burst tyre? The 1984 Ford Telstar came equipped with S-rated tyres, designed for maximum speeds of 180 kilometres per hour. At almost 200 kilometres, sustained over several minutes, tyre failure wasn't just possible, it was probable. Dr. Richard Haynes, a NASA scientist, analysed samples and found that interior dust differed slightly from the exterior samples. This was potentially significant, but nothing that suggested extraterrestrial or truly anomalous origin. The RAAF, Royal Australian Air Force, confirmed no military aircraft were in the area that night, ruling out any classified military activity. And then came the atmospheric explanation. A.T. Brunt, former Regional Director of the South Australian Bureau of Meteorology, published a detailed analysis showing that weather records confirmed a pronounced temperature inversion extending across the Nullarbor on January the 20th, 1988. Warm air sitting above colder air. These conditions, as we've mentioned, create superior mirages, Fata Morgana effects, where distant light sources can appear elevated above the horizon, distorted, seeming to float and dance. Brunt suggested the Knowles family initially saw distant headlights from a truck travelling in their direction, which they correctly identified at first. But then exhaustion, isolation, darkness, and escalating group panic transformed a strange light into an attack. Psychologist Robert Bartholomew classified the case as small group panic, where normal healthy people, as a result of unusual events, grow paranoid and literally scare themselves. The conditions were perfect. 13 hours of driving through unfamiliar and isolated terrain in total darkness, minimal sleep. In this state, a kangaroo at the roadside might become a figure with a trolley, as we discussed with the Pilliga Princess case. Brake dust might become alien residue. A tyre blowout might feel like an attack. The brain, seeking patterns in ambiguous stimuli, interprets everything through the lens of fear. The voice distortion. After 13 hours driving through arid desert, the family's vocal cords were likely dried out, producing naturally hoarse, lower-pitched speech. Every physical detail had a mundane explanation. Every sensation could be attributed to exhaustion and panic. The case, from a scientific standpoint, was closed. Except Graham Henley saw it too, and so did the tuna boat crew. And Faye Knowles touched something soft and rubbery on her car roof, and 4 people who had nothing to gain from lying insisted that they experienced exactly what they said they experienced. The media attention that seemed like validation quickly became a nightmare for the Knowles family. 4 months after the incident, they had fled their Perth home. Patrick explained why. Their former friends and acquaintances thought they were crazy. The incident cost them approximately $18,000, significantly more than they ever gained. A devastating sum for a family already struggling financially. They eventually lost the car when they couldn't meet the repayments, after a promoter named Wes Johnston took it with promises of lucrative public appearances that never materialised. Patrick's reflection was bitter. I don't think a single reporter or journalist asked sensible questions or tried to console us for our fear. They just wanted to humiliate us. The family's simple plea spoke volumes. We just want to get on with our lives, find jobs, and settle down somewhere in Perth, where people don't ridicule us on the street. They never wavered from their account. They never changed key details, and gained nothing but ridicule. That consistency, more than anything else, lends credibility to their experiences. Hoaxes typically crack under sustained scrutiny. They modify their stories continuously to maintain interest or address inconsistencies. They seek any opportunity to profit from notoriety. The Knowles family did none of these things. They simply maintained with quiet insistence that something happened to them on the Nullarbor on the 20th of January 1988. Something that lifted their car off the road. Something that Faye touched. Soft, warm, spongy. Something that covered them in a black ash and distorted their voices and terrified them so completely that police officers who saw them 5 hours later had no doubt whatsoever that genuine trauma had occurred. Almost 40 years have passed since that January morning, and the Knowles family UFO incident occupies an uncomfortable middle ground in Australian mystery law. The physical evidence, when analysed, proved mundane. Road dust, brake material, predictable tyre damage from excessive speed. The atmospheric conditions that night could produce exactly the kind of floating, glowing mirage the family described. The psychological factors, extreme fatigue, isolation, darkness, and escalating group panic, provide a plausible mechanism for how a strange light became an attack. And yet the evidence doesn't neatly close the case. The Nullarbor has been testing travellers since Edward John Eyre nearly died crossing it in 1841. It tested the Knowles family in 1988. And whatever happened on that isolated highway in the pre-dawn darkness, whether atmospheric, psychological, or something genuinely unexplainable, it left them changed forever. The skeptics have their explanations. all supported by science, and perhaps all true. But when you drive the Nullarbor yourself, you'll understand why the Knowles family story endures. You'll experience that absolute isolation, that sense of being the only human for hundreds of kilometres in any direction. You'll see those stars so numerous, they cast shadows. You'll feel that weight of emptiness pressing in from all sides. And if you see a strange light on the road ahead, hovering just above the highway in the pre-dawn darkness, moving in ways that light shouldn't move, well, perhaps you'll understand the choice Sean Knowles made when he pressed that accelerator to get a closer look. Truth. Thanks for listening. If this tale of highway terror and unexplained phenomena kept you checking your rearview mirror, follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Tell a few mates while you're camping over these summer holidays, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on the next creepy instalment. But until then, remember that some roads cross more than just geography. They cross into places where our comfortable explanations start to unravel, and the impossible becomes just possible enough to keep us awake at night. Catch you next time.